Welcome, welcome. I've been practicing Taichi to learn how to align my cheese. If only I could also learn how to align my crackers, my party platter would be complete. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just that I've got the ASRock Taichi and I've been playing with it, and it's actually kind of a lot of fun. So the ASRock Taichi is a new X99 motherboard to go with Broadwell E. Now, you don't necessarily have to use Broadwell E. You could use any Socket 2011 processor in here, including Xeons. But this is a new board from ASRock that I think is meant as a sort of middle of the road, sort of everyman X99 motherboard if you find yourself needing X99. Let's take a look at the board. First off, you'll notice that it's got this sort of understated black and white aesthetic. It's got this kind of gear, and they've used the CMOS battery as sort of the central place for the gear, so that you look at it and it's like, oh, they've put a gear in the middle of the motherboard, but the CMOS battery is actually the center of the gear, which is sort of fun. Everything else on the motherboard sort of follows this black and white aesthetic. There's a chrome ASRock logo and a chrome X99 that has plastic on it that you can peel off, but other than that, pretty much everything is black and white. Now, the plastic cover around the I/O area and the Purity Sound 3 sound card, which is the onboard sound solution, which is based on a Realtek codec, is white plastic. You can unscrew it from the bottom if that doesn't suit your aesthetic. Now, you'll notice that this motherboard has 3x16 slots, and they are armored and reinforced. These by 16 slots can operate at by 16 by 8 by 8 in the case of a 40-lane CPU, or by 8 by 8 by 8 in the case of a 28-lane CPU, because when you're getting Socket 2011, your CPU may be 28 lanes or 40 lanes. Now, there are also two PCI Express by 1 slots. Now, these are PCI Express 2.0 slots. There are also two M.2 slots, one of which is 110 millimeters. Now, pay attention, because if you've got a 40-lane CPU, you'll be able to use both M.2 slots with PCI Express SSDs. But if you've got a 28-lane CPU, you are not going to be able to use one of the M.2 slots because there's not enough PCI Express lanes for it. Now, in testing this motherboard, we've got a 6800K that we use for overclocking. We were able to hit 4.5 gigahertz with that CPU at 1.3 volts. Get it pretty stable. Sometimes it's only 4.5 gigahertz on a couple of cores. With this particular motherboard, using the G.Skill DDR4 3200 memory, we were only able to achieve a stable clock speed of about 4.3, 4.4 gigahertz. But considering the relative low cost of the motherboard, I think that's pretty good. It does have a 12-phase power design, but I couldn't tell if that was really the holdup, or maybe it's just CMOS settings or something in the UEFI. It's possible that a future UEFI update might make it even a little bit more overclockable, but honestly, 4.3 on a 6800K is nothing to complain about. Let's take a look at the connectors on the back of the board. Now, on the back of the board, we've got two USB 2.0 ports, a combination PS2 mouse and keyboard port. That's great for people like me that still use the PS2 Model M. Then we've got our onboard wireless plus Bluetooth 4.0 solution. Now, this is an 802.11 AC solution, and it is removable. It is in a vertical M.2 slot, but it's the M.2 that's wired for this type of peripheral, so I don't think you can remove it and start using it for PCI Express storage. You might be able to, but I wasn't adventurous enough to actually give that a try. Then there's a clear CMOS button. Then you've got your as media powered USB 3.1 Type A and Type C connector. This is a 10 gigabit per second USB 3.1 solution. Then we got three USB 3.0 ports, one USB 2.0 port. Although if you look closely, it looks like it's a USB 3 port. No, USB 2. Then we've got dual LAN. Now, both of these are Intel gigabit LAN. One's an i218V and the other one is an i211. Both of those are an Intel gigabit NIC solution. Then we got our audio codec, which is a 7.1 surround along with an optical SPDIF port. Now, the audio solution in this case is 7.1 channel based around the Realtek ALC 1150. That does support Blu-ray audio, and it has surge protection on the ports. It's Purity Sound 3, so you get the Japanese Nishikon capacitors, 115 dB signal to noise ratio, and a TI-NE 5532 premium headset amplifier, which supports up to 600 ohm headsets. It does have a noise filtering circuit on the power input for it to further drive the noise down, and of course the PCB is isolated so that hopefully no other digital noise or anything else will creep into the audio solution because it's on its own part of the printed circuit board. The audio solution also supports DTS Connect. Now, for the onboard wireless, I did take a look at it. Even though it is 802.11 AC, the maximum throughput's about 433 megabit because it doesn't seem to be a MIMO solution. The Bluetooth 4.0 worked brilliantly, of course, So if you wanted a beefier, multi-input, multi-output wireless solution, you would have to get a different wireless solution or replace the built-in M.2 card with a different M.2 card. Let's take a look at our connections along the bottom of the board. Now at the bottom of the board, we've got our HD audio connector, a clear CMOS jumper, and then we've got an A and a B BIOS along with an A and B BIOS select switch. So this is dual BIOS and you can flip between A and B using the mechanical switch. Then we've got our front panel connectors, which are these two headers here. Then we've got our TPM header. Then we've got an RS-232 COM port header along with two internal USB 2.0 headers. So if you have an internal USB peripheral like a water pump or something like that you want to plug directly into a USB header, well, you've got two headers with which to do that. Coming around the front, we've got our 8 SATA 3 6 gigabit per second ports, two of which double as a SATA Express connection. Then we've got a fan header. Then we've got our front panel USB 3.0 header and our ATX power. At the top of the board are two 4-pin fan headers, one for the CPU and one for a water pump or other high current device that mirrors the CPU fan header. Then we've got our 8-pin power input from the ATX power supply. This motherboard does have 8 DDR4 DIMM slots supporting DDR4 up to 3233, which of course is 128 gigabytes on this particular platform. Now this motherboard does support Xeon CPUs up to 18 cores, has been validated in the manual. They'll probably test some other Xeons with this motherboard if you want to go crazy and get the 22 core Xeon. If you do use a Xeon on this board, you're not going to be able to use error correcting memory like you would with a server grade chipset. But if you see a low cost 6 or 8 or 10 core Xeon, it's very likely it's going to cost less than the desktop counterpart, although it may be clocked at a lower clock speed. So if you're doing something that needs a lot of cores, it doesn't really matter as much on the clock speed side of things. Yes, you can put a low cost Xeon in this motherboard and save yourself a few bucks. This motherboard has a total of 5 4-pin fan headers. And just below the RAM slots are 2 additional SATA 6 gigabit per second ports. Now this motherboard, like a lot of other X99 motherboards this season, and even motherboards from before, depending on if you're running a 28-lane CPU or 40-lane CPU, if you get one of the lesser expensive CPUs, it's only going to have 28 PCI Express lanes of connectivity as opposed to the more expensive CPUs, which have 40 PCI Express lanes of connectivity. You're not going to be able to use all of the peripherals on the motherboard at once. Typically, it's not really a big deal though. It'll say in the manual, like these SATA ports share connectivity with these M.2 slots, or you can't use both M.2 slots if you are running a 28-lane CPU, but if you're running a 40-lane CPU, then you'll be able to use both M.2 slots. Things like that are something that you have to watch out for in general with this generation of motherboard. So if you're considering this motherboard, be sure that you check the manual so that you know which combinations of ports are available. Now, if you do actually get a 28-lane CPU and you did want to run 2 M.2, it's not really a big deal. You wouldn't be able to use one of the M.2 on the motherboard, but you could get a PCI Express slot to M.2 adapter and use in the bottom slot. The first slot is by 16 for the graphics card, and it will only run at by 8 if both other slots are populated and you're using a 28-lane CPU. If you're using a 40-lane CPU, the top slot is always going to be 16 lanes pretty much, no matter what you're doing with this particular board. Overall, I think this layout is pretty smart because it keeps costs down, but it's a reasonable set of functionality so that even if you're an enthusiast and you've got peripheral add-in cards like an HDMI capture card, or maybe you've got a PCI Express NVMe as opposed to an M.2 NVMe, this gives you the functionality that you need to sort of mix and match peripherals and have a lot more than just a graphics card. And this generation of graphics cards with the 1080, at least they're sort of frowning upon 3-way SLI. This motherboard does come with the old style SLI bridge as well as the new style SLI bridge, the high bandwidth SLI bridge. So if you are going to run, two 1080s on this motherboard, it does come with the SLI bridge that you need to do that in the box. Now, if you want to do 3-way on older generation NVIDIA cards, that's completely fine. If you want to do 3-way Crossfire, that's completely fine as well. You've got a lot of options with this motherboard. This is a pretty solid desktop board in my opinion in terms of the functionality, and I've only had a chance to test it for a few days. I haven't really put it through its paces or burned it in or anything, but overall it seems like a pretty solid board. It's an 8-layer board, 12-phase power delivery, reasonable overclocking options. The UEFI is pretty well organized. ASRock has put a lot of work into their UEFI and really improving it, and the improvements over the last couple of generations of boards from ASRock has been really dramatic. So I've been really impressed with the amount of improvement that they've been able to do over the last 2 or 3 generations of motherboards. So kudos. Now, if you end up picking up one of these, I want to hear from you. I want you to let me know what your experiences are in the forum over at techsyndicate.com. How hard was it to overclock? How hard was it to put together? What did you think of the manual? This motherboard has one of the smallest to the point manuals of any motherboard that I've seen in a long time. It's like 12, it's not really 12 pages, but it's a very small manual. It's just like, here's all the stuff. You know what you're doing. Good luck. It's like, wow, okay, cool, thanks. Because they didn't put a lot of fluff in there. They didn't put 12 languages in the manual. It was really nice. And you open the box and there's cables. There's a back plate, which has little gears on it, which features the sort of, you know, gear design thing. It would be a lot of fun maybe to build a steampunk computer with something like this, because the capacitors have that little bit of a brass color and it's black and white. Good Lord, what is wrong with me? What happened to basic black PCBs? There's no BS with this motherboard. If you want an X99 desktop board and you're going to get a 28 lane CPU, or you're going to get a, you know, a previous generation CPU, and you just want an X99 motherboard because you're going to run 6 or 8 cores, this is a pretty solid choice. So if you pick up one of these, or you're thinking about getting one of these and you want to share with the forum, or if you got one of these and you just want to share your build, head over to the forums at techsyndicate.com and show me pictures. Post what you're building, show me what you're up to. It'll be a lot of fun. Connect with the community. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you in the forums.